Welcome back, everyone, to our newest episode of In the Den, a Greenville ISD podcast, where today we are excited to talk about school finance. I'm your host, Zachary.
I'm Natalie. What's up, Greenville?
And we are super excited to discuss all things school finance with you. So, without further ado, let's get to budgeting basics, navigating the path to adopting a school budget. What is going on, line listeners, and welcome back to In the Den, a Greenville ISD podcast. As you just heard, we have a great episode ahead for you. We're joined in studio by two finance gurus, our Chief Financial Officer for Greenville ISD, Coy Martin, and Director of Finance, Brenda Russell. Welcome, guys.
Hey, yo, what's up?
Hey.
We are so excited to have you guys on the episode today, and I know all of our listeners are excited to hear all things budgeting information-wise. But first, we want to know a little bit more about you guys. We want to know how long have you guys been in the finance game? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I have been in education for almost 13 years now. I spent about 12 years at A&M Commerce, so that's higher education, working primarily with budgets and finance, but also did a little bit of payroll and purchasing, as well as did a lot with grants there. I've been at Greenville ISD for almost a year. I'm coming up on my 1-year anniversary. Woo woo! My educational degrees are a bachelor in business administration with focus on accounting and a master's of science in accounting, both from A&M Commerce.
Wow. Okay. That's phenomenal. Brenda?
So I have been in the business. I am in my 15th year now, started here at Greenville ISD.
Wow.
Well, actually, let me put that. I have been in finance prior to that in the banking world for about 10 years prior to that. So, but I am in my 15th year here. Started out as accounts payable.
Okay.
Moved up into purchasing, and then I have done some payroll as well. And now I'm in the director of finance position. So
Awesome.
And
Yeah.
I also do have a degree that I have recently accomplished.
Great.
So,
Congratulations.
thank you. And it is in the business administration with a focus on accounting as well.
Nice.
Wow. We have some
Numbers,
really
numbers.
solid people in our department
We
here.
do.
That's phenomenal.
We do. So tell us about your department. Tell us what it entails. Tell us what the different roles are. Just tell us more about it.
Sure. Yeah. We are made up of several different areas. A lot of people, when you hear about finance, you just automatically think finance, money, budget, but we actually encompass everything money. So that would include finance, accounts payable, purchasing, grants. And then we have the payroll side, which is everything, all things payroll, as well as benefits. And then one of the areas that also kind of fall under me is child nutrition. A lot of people don't realize that. It's just a fun fact because it is federally funded. And so, yeah, child nutrition falls under us as well.
Yes.
No, wow. That's a lot. I mean, like you said, I think a lot of people have a misconception, especially in the school business world, that finance is just cutting the checks to pay for the things that the school needs to pay for. But, even sometimes we don't realize it encompasses. I know our staff appreciate the finance department because it has payroll in it and they get all of their paychecks from the finance department. But even things like you mentioned, like the benefits side of things or even grants, I know that that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later possibly, but something that is kind of newer to the finance department as far as someone solely dedicated to doing that. So that's super exciting.
Yeah.
I know all the talk right now in the business office is the next fiscal year, and we'll talk about what fiscal means here in a minute, I hope, but that the next fiscal year is coming up. And with that being said, that means that there has to be a budget in place for the next school year. And that would put us in what you guys may consider the budget season, possibly.
Yeah, that's right.
This is a very crazy time for us because we're trying to close out one fiscal year and begin another fiscal year. So it's a very, very crazy time for us.
But I know you guys manage it really well. So just watching the finance team work together, you guys are so cohesive in getting all that together. But for those of our listeners that don't know, what does budget season kind of entail?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, but I'm going to try to simplify it the best I can. And Brenda, hop in when you want. But it's quite a long process. There's a lot of legalities we have to follow. And that's the thing that most people don't realize. We're following, guidelines from TEA, our local laws and things, policies that we have to follow within the district. But ultimately, we're starting this thing 6, 7 months out before even the end of this current fiscal year. So we started kind of early on in December, and then we go all the way through the end of June, and we have to adopt a budget before the end of June happens. The board, that's a legal requirement. We can't go into a new fiscal year without adopting a budget because we have to be able to pay people, we have to pay expenditures and things like that. And so, for those of you who don't know, our fiscal year actually starts July 1st. I know that kind of sounds unusual. It's the middle of a year, but yes, our first day is July 1st, the new fiscal year. There's a lot of other school districts in the state of Texas that actually start on September 1st. And so that's actually one of the two options. We used to be September 1 and now we're July 1. So there's a lot of actually preliminary work that has to be done. That's why we have to start so early. We develop this budget calendar. We talk about that so often, especially with the school board, because it kind of helps keep us accountable for our goals and where we need to see it ourselves along the way. And so, one of the most important parts is, establishing, what priorities we need to see in the new budget once we get there. And so that's a lot of meetings with our budget managers, and talking those things out. Brenda, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So what we do is usually starting at the end of February, beginning of March, is we will go and meet with each budget manager or campus administrator, sit down and kind of go over what their current budget is for our fiscal year, see how their expenditures are doing, seeing where their needs are, if they need to increase in any areas, if we need to decrease in any areas. Just kind of sitting down and speaking to them to kind of see that, so we can see what numbers are going to be able to work with for the following year.
That's good. I think that's important too. That it's important whether you're looking at corporate America budget or you're looking at a school budget. I think it's important that you analyze these things as often as you do, just to make sure, hey, is there an area that we do need to kind of shift the budget around for the next year? We didn't spend near as much as we intended to in X column, but we know that there's a big priority in B column. So maybe looking at that, I think that that's super helpful and super beneficial to be able to analyze that as closely as you guys are doing. I think it helps us stay on target as a district to make sure we are financially sound.
I think what a lot of people don't realize is that we're basically predicting the future. We're working in a current fiscal year for another fiscal year that's happening, 6, 7, 8 months away. And so we're basically magicians, is what I like to say, because
finance magicians.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
We carry that wand and say, ta-da!
That's basically the sum of it. We're constantly predicting the future here. We're using current year and previous year data to kind of do trends and analysis to try to figure out what next year will look like in reality. Because there's so many factors that come into play here. We're talking how many kids are actually in the seats when they take attendance, because that's what guides our funding ultimately. And so if kids aren't in the seats, we're not getting the funding.
Sure.
And so say one semester where, we have X amount and then the next semester it goes down, I have to make adjustments on our end to say, oh crap, we're going to actually get less money than we anticipated. So
Sure.
That's why we push and push and push that having kiddos in the seat are so important to school funding.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And the other thing too is that we have to kind of determine as well is emergency situations that may come up. You're not planning for anything, major to happen. But for instance, if you have a maintenance and operations that may happen that may be costly and we didn't, plan for that during our planning time, then you kind of have to start revisiting the budget and kind of reworking it so we can accommodate to have those needs met as well. So
I think that's what a lot of people don't realize that are out there in the community. Maybe that a lot of the stuff that we have to find emergency funds for, like Brenda talked about, is that it's maybe not stuff that you necessarily see. We've had a lot of plumbing problems this year. And so that stuff will be beneath the ground. And so people in the community may not necessarily see that, but we're pushing and having to push a lot of money into those things.
Yeah.
HVAC, which is on top of the roofs,
Sure.
things like that.
mm-hmm.
No, absolutely. Those are all super important things to consider when we're building the budget out. I mean, is there any other key considerations? I know we talked about, predicting kind of what is our ADA or average daily attendance going to be like for the next year? What is our student enrollment going to be like? What kind of state funding and federal funding are we going to be getting? All of those things. But are there any other additional key considerations that you guys consider when you develop the budget? Are there any other things that we, as regular people who don't sit in the finance chair, don't think about too often?
Yeah, so we're honestly, again, with the predictions, whenever we have a increasingly populated schools that every year we're expecting higher and higher growth, we have to figure out how many teachers are going to be required to teach those classrooms. Do we have enough chairs in the classrooms to sit in? Do we need to buy furniture? Do we even have enough classrooms, period? Are we going to have to shuffle schools around? There's so much that goes into that, and that's just one small piece. We
Sure.
also have all with increased rooms and usage, we have more maintenance and operation needs, and we need more custodial in those areas. And it's just one thing after another that kind of piles up, I think. And so we need more paraprofessionals in the classroom when there's more students. Um, and so we have to really look at that and kind of like I said, put our trend analysis into effect and
Sure.
look at basically what I did was look at the past 5 years to kind of see what that looked like.
Right.
And one of the biggest struggles is with looking back 5 years is we had COVID in there. And so COVID really skewed our data. And so it made it even more hard to be able to figure out what the next year and the next year will look like. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but we're not just looking at next year. Whenever we're estimating our revenues out, we're actually looking numerous years into the future.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out how we can sustain, new programs and growth and things like that in, the long-term future.
That's good.
So when you start planning the budget for next year, is it one and done? You set it like, here's the numbers and we go, or what's the review process look like?
That's a great question. It's very fluid is what I would say. We sometimes have to go to the board and say, hey, look, we had this emergency so we're going to have to adjust the budget a little bit. And so whenever what that would look like is we go to the school board and we do what's called a budget adjustment or a budget amendment. We're literally having to shuffle what we currently have and just make it work to where we can still pay for things. And if it's a true emergency that we are not sure that we are going to be able to afford within the existing revenues, we have to go and basically ask for money to come out of what's called fund balance, and which is basically our money that we have to use for, what would you call that, Brenda? A rainy day?
For a rainy day, yeah, that's basically in the school finance world. That's what they call it. What they suggest that you keep on hand is enough to operate for your district for about 3 months. So in case anything was to happen and you had to operate, like if our funding did get cut or if, got put on hold for any reason, you have this, it's almost basically like a little savings account.
Yeah,
is
like an
what I would
emergency
kind of
savings
compare
account.
it to. So,
Yeah.
But they usually try to suggest that you maintain at least a 3-month operating balance in there. And like Coy did indicate that when, major projects do come up or, something like that, then we do have to go before the board and maybe ask them to dip into that savings
Sure.
account per se to be able to take care of those.
So I know Natalie kind of hinted at it a little bit, but especially in like the planning process, for example, the terms, first reading, second reading, third reading, those things get thrown around.
Yeah.
What does that mean when you say do you just, get up there and read off budget
He just
number
starts
one?
reading a book and
Yeah.
saying, okay, budget 101.
Exactly. But what does that look like?
Yeah, it's actually multi-phase is the best way to describe it. And so whenever you hear multiple readings, that's essentially what that means. So we actually have I would call it a pre-phase is the budget workshop. That's where we go to the board very early on and say, here's what we think is going to happen. We don't have any true data yet. We're actually just working off of past year. We don't have any estimates, anything. So this is what we think will happen. Then we go into the first reading, which is really just more information. We still don't have our, preliminary tax values or anything like that. We're still just saying, hey, this is what I think it'll be. Here's what our budget priorities need that we need to fund next year, et cetera. And then we go into the second budget reading, which is where we actually go to them and say, hey, we actually, looking at these budget priorities, we actually want you to vote and do this, this, and this based on administrative recommendation. And so that's around May. And then we have our third and final reading at the last Tuesday in June. It'll always be the last Tuesday in June because we have to not only discuss get the budget adopted, because as I mentioned before, we legally have to adopt that before we go into a new fiscal year on July 1st. But we also have to talk about the proposed tax rate. We have to go into this fiscal year knowing or having an expectation of what the tax rate will look like. And then finally, we also have to do any budget amendments for that current year to say, oh, we actually have more revenues than we expected or less or whatever. And we have to make adjustments based on all those things. So that budget calendar I mentioned earlier, that we actually outline all of that so the board is very clear on what our expectations are.
So it is crucial, and it's come July 1, it is set. This is the budget.
Yes.
And that's mandatory. Like you have to have a approved budget before, like Coy mentioned earlier, before you can start your next fiscal year. If you don't have that approved budget, then you cannot begin any spending.
We can't cut
Including
checks.
Yeah.
We
payroll.
cannot cut
Mhm.
checks.
You can't do payroll. You can't do paying of the utilities. You can't do anything.
So I know
Yeah.
all of our staff appreciate the timeliness of that calendar of making sure that that's
Yeah.
all taken care of.
Yes.
We talked about you're not the financial meteorologist per se, or you seem to kind of have to act in that capacity when we're talking about budgets and things like that. But how do you guys ensure? Is there some sort of process or procedure or some sort of template or anything like that that you guys use
Magic
actually?
8-ball.
Yeah, right. Right. Is it one of those you shake it? Yes.
I wish
maybe
it was.
So.
Yeah, that would make it so much
but
easier.
Exactly. But I will let Coy take this one because he is the one that spreadsheet guru is what I would call this, because that's what it does entail. So I'll let him kind of explain the behind the scenes on that.
Yeah, so we have this thing called Omar's template, is just generically what it's called across the state of Texas. Just like a small background, Omar is this guy. He used to work in school finance and school districts in Texas, and he realized how complicated and hard it was to project revenues. Just simply, I mean, it is very challenging. And so he came in and said, oh, I'm going to create this spreadsheet, and it's going to help school districts predict what the revenues will look like, at least in some aspects. And this spreadsheet is gigantic. It is very, very large. It's hundreds of tabs long. And so that is what I want to make very clear. Anytime I talk
And all
about
the
this,
Excel people said, "Ooh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. Let me get my hands on
Tabs.
that.
It'll take a minute sometimes to save that sucker. It's so large.
Wow.
And so I just want to say that that's, what kind of what we're dealing with. I'm so thankful for it, because I'm not sure it wouldn't be near, it would be so much more complicated to do this job if it wasn't for that thing. And so, we use that. We basically have to come in and plug in current student data numbers from PEMS. And so basically those butts in the seats per se. And so it breaks down CTE, bilingual, breaks down SPED. And so we get special funding for each of those types of things. And so that breaks it down, and it'll kind of tell us based on what our tax rate is, what our local property values will be,
Mhm.
as well as our state revenues.
So it sounds like you guys had to put a work order into technology to get your own hard drive to run this template.
Right.
Yeah.
A little fact also on this template is the gentleman, Omar, who did create this, is the one that still maintains it
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
and does the updates and so forth. Well, the scary part about that is he's not as young as he was when he created this and will probably retire soon. And no one else in the state of Texas knows how to update this template to keep it maintained. So we're all just kind of
Panic.
Yes. And so I have asked Coy to take it upon himself
gosh.
to maybe look into this.
So it'll be the Omar Martin template.
Exactly.
Omar Martin. We'll hyphenate it.
But no, they seriously have been indicating that he is close to retirement. And that is one thing that the school districts are, very fearful of, because
Sure.
it is what 95% school districts in the state of Texas do utilize to come up with those numbers for their revenues.
Sure.
Wow.
So it sounds like we're going to have the Omar Martin template. That's good. But also one thing I wanted to mention, I think I heard you mention this, and I may be a liar, but you have been able to actually reach out to Omar personally and have established a relationship with him.
Yeah. So I actually, since I've been in this job, I've been able to network and reach out to a lot of other school districts for one. And we kind of rely on each other to kind of check our own data to see
Sure.
like how we're looking. And I actually one day just I was like, I'm gonna reach out to him and see if he'll email me back. Kind of
Mhm.
like I'm like fangirling over here. Like I wonder if he'll respond. And he did within like a few hours.
Wow.
I was just so impressed. I was telling Brenda like I think I'm gonna frame this email because I was so excited.
I know he came out of his office like, oh my gosh, he responded. I think I'm going to print this out and frame it.
It is printed,
That's
just
awesome.
FYI.
I wondered
get a
what that
frame
was
for
on the
that.
wall.
Yeah.
Does he live close? Could we get an autograph?
Yeah, right. Exactly. I mean, he comes to our annual finance conference at Region 10, which is next month. So I'm like, please sign.
Yeah.
I'll bring it with me.
That's great. That's great. So I don't know a whole lot about finances. So tell me, what is the difference? There's the general fund, there's child nutrition, there's the debt services, there's all these different funds and budgets. Can you break it down?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, this goes back to our legal requirements. We're legally required to get school board approved to approve 3 budgets. That's the general fund, child nutrition fund, and debt services fund. And so you can go beyond that, but a lot of school districts don't because that is our primary sources of revenue, right? So the general fund, its primary use is for general maintenance and operations. And I know when people hear maintenance and operation, they're like, oh, that one department, but it actually encompasses, that's everything.
The
That's
entire operation of the district.
yes, operations of district, everything district. That's the money from that kind of comes from local property taxes, from our M&O budget, from state revenues. Then we have our child nutrition budget that is federally funded through the National School Lunch Program and the National School Breakfast Program. And so that, we pay for all these things and do all these things, and we get that money completely reimbursed back to us. And then finally, you have the debt services budget, which is basically how you pay off of our bonded indebtedness. So I know that we haven't had a bond in a long time, but we still have bonded debt from years
Sure.
ago. We're currently working on paying those off. I just want to throw that line in there. We're defeasing debt regularly. We've talked about it in numerous school board meetings now. Super exciting that that's happening because it's cutting off years off of our debt
That's
payments.
awesome.
But that comes from the interest and seeking fund from local property taxes, and that's the only source it can come from legally.
Oh, that's great. I want to take about 2 seconds back on child nutrition.
Sure.
I know I was sitting in a board meeting that you were doing. I think it was your budget workshop possibly, or it may have just been a monthly financial report, but you had mentioned that your team was working on some sort of program for our students and child nutrition. Do you mind delving into that for a second?
Sure, absolutely. So we actually submitted an application for what's called CEP, or community engagement provision. And so what that basically means, and this was really popular during COVID, it means that everyone in that school, whatever campus you have, no matter what their socioeconomic status is, they would get full free and lunch and breakfast regardless. So we actually, based on our Greenville ISD socio and economic makeup, we actually are putting in an application in because that percentage is really high. And we actually just today got pre-approval.
Wow.
And so we're really excited about that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so we're waiting for the final approval on that, which will come any day now. But what that means right now for our next school year's kids is that we would basically be able to offer, free at cost to all families in the school district lunch and
That is
breakfast.
so wonderful.
We're
Yes.
super excited.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
think it's a
do-
great
Oh,
thing.
yeah, I do too. I think that that's phenomenal. I know that
It's one less worry for any parent.
any
Right.
parent,
So-
student,
Exactly.
all
And
of
what a
those.
great thing to offer, and a great partnership between child nutrition, finance, and just the district and the community as a whole. Great job.
We're super excited
Great job.
to roll this out. Like I said, shout out Cherie has been working extremely hard in her area for this to happen, and I've been excited since I learned about it. And so next school year is going to be looking really good so far.
Mhm.
We love that.
We can't wait to hear and get
Yeah.
that final word. And woohoo.
Yes.
Yes.
You mentioned it a couple of times, but I definitely want to have a quick conversation about it because I think it's important to understand kind of where the sources of revenue come for a school district. You talked about local tax revenue.
Yeah.
We've talked about grants earlier, that kind of thing. But what are the primary sources of ISD revenue? What does that look like? Should the community know about that?
Yeah, so I think that's something that a lot of people get mixed up about because we do have a lot of different sources in reality. So the primary 3 are like local state, and federal. Local funding consists of your local property taxes that are generated from the tax rate that the school board sets. That is generated as a percentage of property tax income that homeowners pay every year. One part of that I just should add is our maintenance and operations tax rate that's specific in the total tax rate that goes towards the general fund that I mentioned earlier. And the other side of that is interest and seeking, and that encompasses our total tax rate revenue. Gotcha. The second part is state revenues, which is just to simply put, is just to offset, to help make it work from TEA. It's money we get directly from them. It's spread out throughout the fiscal year, depending on your school. And so before I move on, the best way to explain that is say your local property taxes go up, state revenues go down. It's like a seesaw. And so whenever your local property values go down, it's supposed to have the opposite effect of where TEA will come in and increase your allotment. And so it's just like a seesaw effect. It goes up and it goes down depending on what your local stuff looks like.
So that kind of almost busts the myth of, people thinking that we are getting a higher percent off tax rate or tax values go up. And so they're paying, or they see that they're paying a little bit more in, or that their tax payment changes. And so I think that the assumption that, well, if they're getting more local revenue and the state revenue remains the same, then in theory we should be getting more money. But the truth of the matter is the state actually looks at those numbers that we're getting in local revenue and then adjusts the revenue that they're going to be giving to the districts at the state level. Does that sound pretty accurate?
Absolutely. It's always going to be adjusted. We never really see true increases unless our student counts go up. And so the state really doesn't want us to go, like, say that, the property taxes in your town is growing. They will obviously come in and decrease that so that you're kind of leveling out in a way.
Sure.
That's why it makes it really hard, in the budgeting process, trying to figure out, can we add these new programs, or can we give a salary increase to all of the employees? And so, it's just always a challenge knowing that in the back of our minds that they're going to come and do those adjustments. And then I didn't get to finish, but the third source of revenue is federal funding. And I know when you hear federal, you automatically think grants, but it's not. Grants is actually like an arm reach out from revenues. It's a supplement of our revenues. So whenever we say federal revenue, it's actually the smallest portion of the puzzle, I would say, of revenues. That's going to be our E-rate that we get from doing specific technology purchases, indirect costs that we receive from certain grants. So indirect cost means that, you get this really large grant and you get a percentage of that back to pay utilities or whatever. And so that's really all that the federal portion of the budget is. Now, as I mentioned, grants are kind of like this arm reach out for revenues. They come in and we apply, and that's why we have a grant manager for she comes in and does all the management and does all these applications to help supplement our current budget. So it's to really help offset so that we can do all these different things on the side. And I would say, like, currently we are maximizing to the fullest potential our grants. That was one of the biggest things that, whenever I started in Brenda in our roles, we kind of looked at these things and said, we've really got to make the best of all of our money. And that's what we've really been striving to do. And I think we're doing that well.
That's good. I don't want to spoil. I know we have another episode. This is a teaser, but we have another episode with this team scheduled for the fall where we will talk more in depth about grants. But I know just in side conversation with the finance team, Coy used the word millions with an M.
Yep.
Millions.
And an
in
S.
Grant.
Millions.
Grants that are funded to the district. So that's exciting. But like I said, I don't want to spoil that. So keep your ears open for that. Do want to kind of jump back around to we were talking about local revenue and tax rates and things like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Coy, because of course you are the guru in this. But I think as a district, we are sitting at one of our historically lowest tax rates that we've had. And I know the past couple of decades that we're looking at, but some people said, well, that, I'm still paying X amount of dollars in taxes. Could you maybe go into detail on kind of why, if we see a shift in our tax rate going down, what that might look like? Does it have to do with property values? What does that kind of piece of things look like?
Yeah, so it's quite complicated. So I'm just going to try to summarize it to make where it makes sense. So yes, to answer your question, first off, after looking at years and years and years worth of tax rates, we are at a historically low tax rate. We've never been as low as we are right now, and it's going to continue to look like that in the future years. What happens with the tax rate is ultimately TEA likes to say that we have control over that thing, and the school board has control over whatever we want to set, but we don't. We get told that there's this maximum compressed rate, is what it's called, MCR, and they come in and say, "Oh, this is what we're telling you can be the maximum you can do," but it's always less than the previous year. So that's the kind of disheartening part, is we really don't have control, because obviously when they come in and say, "Oh, we're going to set you at this maximum rate," we're going to probably go to the maximum because it's less than it was the year before.
Sure.
And so I just think that's important to know, because they like to say we have control, but we really don't in reality. Coming back to like what that looks like with your property tax values, that's a little bit more complex, because we have recent legislation that came out that reduced everyone's the $100,000 homestead exemption. Everyone's, I'm sure, familiar with that, voted for that, because that's an amazing thing for homeowners specifically. But the effect of that is public schools, we lose money in that regard, because that means that we're receiving that much less in property tax value.
Right.
Even though, so if you think about it, we're receiving that much less in property tax value, but also having a reduced tax rate. So can you imagine what that does to our revenues? So we're really having a big juggling act over here, trying to figure out how we're going to, operate, but with the revenues that we're expecting to get. I hope I summarized that well enough.
No, that was good.
You did. There's a lot. As I'm listening to you, I think,
to
oh
really
my gosh,
try to understand if
there's so much boiling on your stove. And
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why I walked in and I noticed they had a 16 burner stove. I'm just kidding.
Or
That's
was
for
it
the
16
That's for
pots?
child nutrition.
Yeah.
They fall under our department.
So how does the district monitor performance on the budget, like throughout the year?
So okay, that's a good question. We do a lot of things to kind of monitor on a regular basis to make sure that we're not only performing at the standards that we kind of set the expectation of at the beginning of the fiscal year, but that we're being consistent throughout the year. So one of the things that we do is we have a monthly variance report that all of our budget end users have to submit to our office. It's basically to hold them accountable for their spending, and for us to hold them accountable for said spending, because we give them a budget. So we kind of just expect that budget to be spent every fiscal year. And I think that taxpayers would want to see that the schools are spending that money. And so that's what's happening. Schools are spending their money, and we still don't have enough. The other thing is we do a monthly financial report to the board. That's to hold us accountable and kind of to show, what that looks like on a, monthly basis. But it also shows the percentage of the said budget for each line item, what we're kind of spending at that time of the year. We have a quarterly investment report that's presented to the board every quarter, and that talks about basically all cash flows and like what the investments that we may be doing at that time look like, and what we're retaining and earning or yielding, whatever you want to call it. And so, we have I could go on and on, but we have so many different facets of monitoring.
Sure.
We also have, we're held accountable by external auditors. We're held accountable by the first report, because that's a grading, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
But there's so many facets. We're constantly helping and assisting our department budget end users, making sure that we're spending stuff accordingly to the law and to, our procurement guidelines. And so,
that's what I was going to just chime in on that variance report. That's basically, we try to make sure that they're spending, like he said, accordingly, but, we try to tell them spend 25% of your budget by this time of the year, spend 50% by this time, spend 75% by this time. So that's why we're sending that report out, so we can see where they're at their spending, as well as so they can see too, because, those funds are for that particular school year.
Sure.
So you're trying to make sure that what we have given you, you are utilizing and you are using it for that school year. So that kind of holds them accountable, but also holds us accountable as well.
It's good checks and balances.
Yeah, it serves as a good planning guide too, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, the budget end users that are responsible for managing those budgets on the campuses, or whether it's the department, through these variance reports get to actually kind of see firsthand, what does that look like throughout the tenure of the budget year.
Yeah.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
I want to I think, Natalie, that was a great question. And I think it kind of helps leads into whatever the question that I had next. And we won't be here too much longer, but I think that the next two questions are really important. But the next one I have is kind of more modern, right here, right now question. I know throughout just the news and the talk in the ISD world is that we're seeing more and more districts that are coming out with press releases and statements that they're expecting a deficit budget, or that they're expecting that they are overspending what they budgeted for. We're seeing things like position cuts and layoffs and campus closures and things of that nature, which of course, when you look at it at face value, is very alarming.
Mm-hmm.
But what can you kind of insight can you guys give as Greenville ISD specific to kind of let the listeners know that we are being very proactive about those things to ensure that we are taking care of our things and making sure that we're financially healthy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, we have a lot of mechanisms in place, but I think one of the biggest things is, we try to be as conservative as possible whenever we're talking about the budget. And I think a lot of people, I just want to make sure I'm clear on what that means. It just means throughout the year, we're projecting numbers higher, so knowing that they'll come in lower. That way, we're not in that situation of having to adopt a deficit budget. Ultimately, that's what the one big goal I think we have is not to adopt a deficit budget. Um, you know, uh, I think whenever we're expected to create a fiscally responsible guideline in budget, terms, that's our number one goal, in my opinion.
Yes.
Uh, yeah.
That's good. And I think, the things that we've talked about previously, how do we monitor throughout the school year that
Mhm.
we are making sure that we're making good financial decisions, and that we are following kind of that track that we've set in place for the next year, things like variance reports, Omar's template, et cetera. I think, and I'm saying I think because this is what I'm gathering, and hopefully I'm gathering it the correct way, is we have all of these different avenues and facets to make sure that, like you said, that scale is even.
Yes.
So that way we're not ending up and looking back in 2 months and going, well, we're not having to put out a press release that we're
Mhm.
Right.
adopting deficit budgets, or that we're going to have to look into things that people don't want to talk about. And so I think that it's important to know that as a district that we are encouraging kind of this really hands-on approach to leading the proper spending of our dollars, a transparent approach. I think, just to make sure that, like you said, all of our community members are well informed. Hey, this is where your tax money's going. This is how we're handling it. We're being good stewards of where that's coming from. I think all of those things are very important to talk about. And I know Coy and I had a conversation the other day as we were kind of planning for this episode, but um, I said, one of the things that I'm really grateful for is that we are able to sit and say, we know that we're going to be able to have a financially sound budget. We know that we're taking care of the things we're taking care of, and that we're on top of the things, and we're being proactive. And as a district, we are adopting a great budget that we're able to follow and not fall into that kind of that hole of being in a deficit. And don't get me wrong, there are things like state funding and things like that that kind of sometimes hands are tied. But with us being as proactive as we are as a district, I think that speaks a lot of volumes to kind of how we are able to, through the midst of things like COVID or things like state funding, we're able to kind of handle those pots of boiling water
Mhm.
very efficiently.
Mhm.
I think one of the things that you mentioned, COVID, I think a lot of school districts, especially larger ones, they got so much COVID relief funding, and they hired essentially a ton of people with that money. And so whenever we're coming out of into the end phases of COVID relief money, coming up here in September, actually. And so whenever you're looking at it and you're like, oh crap, we have this budget we have to adopt for next year, and we have, 100 and something people or whatever that are currently COVID funded, and we want to keep them. How do we move that to? So that's the problem that people are facing. Luckily, we did like basically a phasing out. So we started, incorporating the positions into the general fund to where it wouldn't be such an extreme hit come this next year. And so essentially, we just planned very strategically and smart.
And I
Um,
think also, speaking of COVID in effect, is, enrollment started going down too, of coming back. And, enrollment is a big part of your funding as well. So I think a lot of these districts that are in a deficit as well is because their enrollment numbers have gone down
Sure.
and they haven't received that funding that
Yeah.
they had anticipated.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
that's one thing that we really are trying to make sure that our attendance is up and, is still increasing with our enrollment.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
Well, and that planning on that with incorporating those employees into the general fund, that how appreciative all of us are to know that you care about us, and it's just we're part of the family, and that goes for if you were hired from that, you're now part of the big family.
correct.
Sure. And I think, it's important to recognize as well that there are facets that COVID essentially revealed to us as an operation, whether it was in corporate America, whether it was, Walmart closing down at 11 o'clock instead of being open 24 hours. There was kind of a lot of things that COVID revealed to us that we could benefit from. And so I think, kind of like Natalie was saying, it's a good thing that we as a district have moved very strategically to capitalize on what we know has become a strength post COVID, and to really, like I said, capitalize and maximize on what we're doing in that regard. We're kind of approaching the point where people would maybe start turning us down or changing the episode. So I don't want to keep people for too long. But the last question I have for you guys is: we talked about this budget calendar. We are currently, as we're sitting here recording this, we are currently in the month of April. Where are we at in this budget calendar as of right now?
So as of right now, we just completed the first budget reading last week. We had the second budget reading coming up the third week of May, and then the final reading the last week of June. And so we're really approaching the crucial time where we've got to really evaluate, what our property tax values are coming in at the end of this month. So next week, I'm going to get the preliminary top property tax values. So I'll really have a better picture. Remember I told you all that estimating?
Yeah.
I was estimating those values so far to date. And so I'll actually have some preliminary values that will actually give me a better handle of what we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. That's awesome. And disclaimer, when he says estimating, they're very, very educated guesses based on research. They're not,
Yes.
It's not just pull a number out of the hat and
Magic.
that's what we'll go with, right?
It's
Well-
that magic 8-ball again. We
Exactly.
shake it.
Yeah,
Say, does this number look good?
exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
Ask again later.
Exactly.
Well, we appreciate both of you guys coming on today and just giving some insight to not only our community members, but us. I know there's a lot of things that we've learned as well as we've gone along this journey of a conversation
Of course.
of adopting a budget. And we are looking forward to, as a district, the closing of one fiscal year and the start of a brand new fiscal year. So like I said, we definitely appreciate all that you guys do. We appreciate everyone and your team and all that they do, especially the ones that make everything happen, which is every single person in your team.
Yeah.
So a big shout out to them. But again, we just want to thank you guys for coming on today and just giving us some insight on all things finance.
Well, thank you for having us. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, we look forward to the fall when we're going to talk about all things auditing, first report, grants, things like that, all the fun stuff. So until further ado, we'll see you guys on our next episode of In the Den, a Greenville ISD podcast. Bye, y'all.
Bye, Greenville.
Bye.